The desert wind in Tunisia carried a bitterness that May of 1943, the kind that stung the eyes and left a film of dust on every uniform button, every rifle sling, every forgotten canteen. Across the flat expanse near Cape Bon, lines of German and Italian soldiers moved slowly toward the collection points. There was no fight left in them. The Afrika Korps, once Rommel's proud expeditionary force, had been whittled down and cornered until even their field commanders could see the futility. Trucks sat abandoned with empty fuel tanks, and helmets hung from bayonets as signals of capitulation. Among those trudging toward captivity was a young Feldwebel named Otto Kramer. His tunic was torn at the elbow, his boots cracked from months in the North African sand. He kept his chin high, more out of habit than conviction, for the propaganda fed to him back in Germany still rattled around in his head. America was soft. America was decadent. A nation of jazz, chewing gum, and loose living, without the discipline or iron will needed to fight a total war. To Otto, surrender to such a people was humiliating. Yet the facts around him told another story. The official count, announced in clipped English by Allied officers with notebooks, was staggering. More than 275,000 Axis soldiers captured in Tunisia in a matter of days. The Wehrmacht had lost entire armies in one stroke. More prisoners than the United States had combat troops in the entire theater. Otto tried not to think about the arithmetic. He focused instead on the heat rising from the sand, the stink of diesel fuel from vehicles that would never run again, and the silence of men too tired to curse their fate. American Sherman tanks, M4A1s with their broad turrets and gasoline engines that whined in an odd way, idled nearby as guards looked on. They were not the elegant machines of German design, not the sleek Panzer IVs or the brutal Tigers he had glimpsed in training, but they were everywhere. Each tank bore stenciled unit numbers from divisions Otto had never heard of. The 1st Armored, the 9th Infantry. Whole regiments of them had poured ashore with supplies stacked like mountains behind them. He could not help noticing the rows of GMC trucks, the 2.5-tonners the Americans seemed to spawn without effort. They called them deuce and a halves. Germany counted each vehicle like a prize. The Americans treated them as if they were disposable. The sun climbed higher, baking steel and sand alike, while British Tommies shared cigarettes with GIs. Otto watched a young American corporal, freckles, rifles slung casually, offer water from a canteen to an Italian prisoner. The gesture was casual, almost careless, but it gnawed at Otto. He had been told these men had no discipline, no seriousness. Yet here they were, well-fed, well-equipped, and utterly confident. As dusk fell, the prisoners were herded toward the coast, where waiting ships would ferry them across the Mediterranean. Otto listened to the distant thrum of Allied aircraft, a sound that filled the sky daily now. He imagined factories somewhere far away, churning out planes faster than his comrades could shoot them down. Still, he held fast to the myth that America lacked staying power. Surely, he told himself, the soft nation could not keep up this pace. Surely they would tire of war. That night, Otto and thousands of others were loaded aboard transports under guard. The sea air mixed with the lingering dust of Tunisia, carrying with it the smell of diesel and salt. Otto settled against the bulkhead, exhausted but unbroken. He had not yet seen the America his captors served. He still believed the Reich would find its second wind. But the journey ahead, across the Atlantic, through rail yards, into the heart of America's industrial machine, would dismantle every assumption he carried. He would soon discover that the nation he mocked as weak was about to build 100,000 planes in a single year, more than Germany could imagine across its entire war. For now, he closed his eyes, confident in old illusions, unaware that the desert surrender was only the beginning of his education. The Atlantic was a gray, endless plain, stretching in every direction, cold and unforgiving. For the German prisoners crowded aboard the RMS Queen Mary in the summer of 1943, it was not the ocean itself that weighed most heavily, but the scale of the vessel carrying them. Otto Kramer had never seen anything so immense. The ship was nearly a floating city, over 1,000 feet long, with towering funnels that belched black smoke into the salt air. Once a luxury liner, she now wore the olive-drab paint of war, ferrying entire divisions in a single voyage. Otto overheard the guards say she could carry 15,000 troops at once. 15,000. It was a number he could hardly process. Back home, he had been told that Allied shipping was weak, that German U-boats would starve Britain and cripple America's ability to reinforce Europe. Yet here he was, on a single ship that dwarfed entire convoys of German transports. If the Allies could spare such a vessel to carry prisoners, he wondered what they reserved for their armies. The ship pitched gently through Atlantic swells, its decks alive with the sound of boots, shouted orders, and the occasional thump of anti-aircraft drills. American guards walked the passageways with rifles slung casually, chatting in a drawl that Otto still struggled to decipher. They seemed relaxed, even amused by the whole operation. For them, the war felt distant, as if the outcome were already written. For Otto, the voyage was a chasm between two worlds, the shattered desert battlefields of Tunisia and a country he had been taught was decadent and divided. At night, lying on a crowded bunk in one of the converted ballrooms, Otto listened to the steady thrum of the ship's turbines. The vibration traveled through steel beams, into his chest, and down into his bones. It was a mechanical heartbeat, strong and steady, a rhythm of industry. He thought of Germany's shipyards, so often hammered by Allied bombers, struggling to push out submarines and freighters. In contrast, here was a British-built liner turned troopship, operating as casually as a ferry. Even as a prisoner, Otto could feel the power of Allied logistics pressing down on him. When at last the Queen Mary glided into New York Harbor, the prisoners crowded the rails. The city rose in front of them, a jagged skyline untouched by war. No bomb scars, no shattered windows, no cratered streets. The skyscrapers gleamed in the morning light, each one taller than any building Otto had seen in Berlin. For the first time, he felt the distance between propaganda and reality. America was not starving. America was thriving. From the docks, the prisoners were funneled onto trains, guarded but not mistreated. The rail cars themselves shocked Otto even more than the skyline. They were Pullmans, sleek, clean, with cushioned seats, heating, and even working lights at night. He had expected cattle cars, or at best the bare benches of German troop trains. Instead, he found himself staring at polished brass fixtures as the countryside rolled by outside his window. The train pushed westward, past towns with gas stations still brightly lit, stores with windows full of goods, fields tilled by tractors that seemed brand new. Otto pressed his face against the glass, taking in every detail. The landscape was unscarred, fertile, humming with life. Unlike Europe, where ration lines and blackout curtains defined daily existence, this land seemed unburdened by war. It was as if the Americans had walled the conflict overseas, fighting with their factories while keeping their homeland prosperous and whole. Sergeant Thomas Red McCaffrey, riding guard in the car, noticed the way the prisoners watched the scenery. He smirked, chewing gum, and muttered loud enough for Otto to catch, "This ain't even the good stuff, boys. You ain't seen nothing yet." Otto said nothing, but the words stung. The comfort of the train, the endless goods outside, the casual swagger of a sergeant who spoke as if victory was already guaranteed. Each detail gnawed at the mythology of German superiority. Somewhere deep inside, the first cracks began to spread. The train carried him further inland, away from the sea, deeper into the America he had mocked. Otto folded his arms and stared hard at the passing barns and factories. He still told himself it was a facade, but already he sensed that this journey was not just a crossing of the ocean. It was the first step into a revelation that would break everything he believed about the war. At first light, the Texas wind came in dry and restless, tugging at the guy wires of the perimeter lights and pushing mesquite dust under the barracks door. Otto Kramer woke to the clatter of tin mugs and the rattle of a screen door, the camp bugle blaring a tune he didn't know. He swung his legs over the bunk and felt floorboards still warm from yesterday's heat, the kind that baked canvas and curled paper edges and turned every breath into a sip from a stove. Through the window slats he saw a sky the color of unpolished steel. A guard strolled the lane with his M1 slung easy, coffee steaming in one hand, rifle in the other, as if both weighed about the same. Breakfast changed nothing and changed everything. White bread, thick, spongy, soft in a way German bread never was, sat in baskets down the table. There was meat, actual meat, and a pitcher of milk with a clinky ring of ice in the tin pan beneath it. A corporal came by with a carton of Lucky Strikes and pinched out 2 cigarettes per man, as if they were buttons from a bottomless box. Otto had been told Americans were frivolous. He had not understood that frivolous here meant abundant. They marched out in work detachments through a gate painted with stenciled numbers and Geneva Convention notices. The sergeant in charge, Thomas Red McCaffrey, handed out instructions in slow, patient English. The detail for the day was a cannery on the edge of town, tomatoes stacked like ammunition, the line moving with an implacable clink and hiss. The factory smell, hot tin, vinegar, grease, got into the seams of their clothing. A farmer's boy cruising past on a bicycle called "Howdy," and Otto, reflexively stiff, gave a nod that he hoped looked neutral. On the road to the cannery, a convoy went by that shook dust from the cotton rows. They were trucks, dozens, then hundreds. GMCC CKWs, their square noses and split windshields lined up like parade blocks. The Americans called them deuce and a halfs, 2.5-ton payload, 6-wheel drive, the kind of simple, brute machine a nation would build by the 100,000. One local foreman, proud to have an audience, told Red that the Army had procured around 2.4 million trucks for the war. Otto did not respond, but the number lodged behind his ribs. Later, Red added, almost offhand, that some 572,500 CCKWs had rolled off lines from Michigan to Missouri. Otto had no enemy figure to place beside it. He only knew how much steel that must be, how many axles and tires, how many miles of rubber road. He learned camp rhythms the way a recruit learns drill. Count the steps from barracks to mess, 81. Count the posts on the fence, 200 and some. Count the cigarettes in the carton, 20, and note that another carton will be there tomorrow. He wrote in his pocket notebook because numbers steadied him. The day's temperature, guessed from the feel of it on his neck. The hours on the cannery line, marked by the squeal of each pallet truck. The number of trucks that passed the gate before noon, 37. When you cannot control your fate, you can count it. Not everything was generous. There were rules, and they bit. Work meant work, and the guards enforced it. A man caught pocketing a tomato learned how quickly American friendliness turned to military efficiency. But even punishment had a procedural neatness to it, a sense that the institution was larger than any one day's anger. It reminded Otto of a factory more than an army. Perhaps that was the point. At supper, Red ambled by and asked in halting German if the food was fine. "It's all right," Otto said, stubborn. Red grinned, rocking on his heels. "You ain't seen nothing," he said, the phrase that had followed Otto from ship to railcar to barracks. "There's a plant up north where they fly a bomber every hour, 1 an hour, round the clock when they need to." He said it the way a man drops a pebble in a well, waiting for the splash. Otto stared at his plate to hide the movement in his face. 1 an hour. It was the kind of statistic men tell to impress one another in bars. Yet his whole day had been an argument against disbelief. New tractors in the fields, fresh paint on freight cars, rail spurs doubling back like veins. Even the wastebasket beside the mess line made its case. Bread heels tossed away that a German family would have kept. That night, the wind fell and the heat lingered. As the barracks settled into a hush, an engine somewhere on the highway downshifted and pulled away, the sound flattening into distance. Otto lay on his back and rehearsed his catechism of superiority, the old bullet points taught in barracks lectures. But the numbers he had collected in pencil would not behave. They kept adding up to something else. Somewhere north, someone had said, a bomber every hour. He closed his eyes and decided it was bragging. He also decided, uneasily, that he wanted to see it with his own eyes. The morning whistle at Willow Run came not from a sergeant's bugle but from factory sirens that shook the parking lots and echoed off corrugated walls. It was April 1944, and southeast Michigan still held the damp chill of spring. Clara Reynolds pulled her scarf tighter, kissed her daughter on the forehead in the neighbor's doorway, and hurried into the flow of women and men funneling toward the mile-long plant. It was a river of humanity, coveralls and lunch pails and thermoses clattering together, all of them knowing they were part of something too large to see in one glance. Inside, the factory breathed like a living thing. Overhead cranes creaked. Pneumatic riveters spat in sharp bursts. Acetylene torches traced blue halos through the dim. The smell was unforgettable. Hot aluminum, oil, paint, and the faint tang of sweat rising from tens of thousands of workers. Clara tied her hair under a scarf, pulled on gloves, and slid into her station on the line. Her job was one among thousands, yet she knew the part numbers by heart. Sheet panel 32B, wing rib assembly 14, fastened with AN 470 AD rivets. Each sound of her hammer drove steel into the war itself. The line never stopped. One Liberator, consolidated B-24D heavy bomber, crawled forward inch by inch as men and women swarmed over it like ants on a carcass. 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines hung waiting, each capable of 1,200 horsepower, each destined to carry the bomber and its crew over Europe. 10 Browning .50 caliber machine guns would soon bristle from the nose, tail, and waist, promising arcs of fire that reached farther than any rifle Otto Kramer had ever carried. The finished aircraft could lift 8,000 pounds of bombs, race at 303 miles per hour, and cross nearly 2,850 miles of sky before thirsting for fuel. But numbers alone did not capture the pace. At Willow Run in April 1944, a bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. In just 3 days, between the 24th and the 26th, 100 bombers lifted from the runway, their twin tails carving contrails over Michigan farmland. It was industrial poetry, a rhythm so steady that factory workers joked they could tell time by the thunder overhead. Clara marked her shift not by clock hands but by the shadow of another Liberator sliding past the hangar windows. She would sometimes pause for a moment, leaning on her hammer, and imagine the journey ahead for each machine. They would be ferried by young pilots, boys barely older than her brother, across the Atlantic, to fields in England where ground crews swarmed with equal precision. From there they would fly in formations so vast they blotted the sun, bound for Berlin or Ploiești, dropping steel in torrents no fortress could withstand. She never saw those raids. Her war was this: hands raw from rivets, a back sore from standing, the small satisfaction of hearing the foreman call out, "Next one moving forward." Outside, the runway was never still. Test crews checked engines, fuel lines, and gun mounts before waving the planes forward. The Liberators roared down the strip, wheels lifting into the gray sky, 4 engines pulling hard as if impatient to join the war. Families in nearby towns would pause their chores to look up and count them, 10, 20, 30 in a day. For the Germans who might one day look across a field and see their shadows, it was inconceivable that such machines were being birthed not in military arsenals, but in what had been a car factory. Clara went home that night with metal shavings in her hair and oil under her nails. She tucked her daughter into bed, and when the little girl asked if she had built a plane that day, Clara answered honestly, "Yes, and another's already on the way." The factory still pulsed in her ears as she lay down. Somewhere above, another liberator was climbing into the night, just one of hundreds that would rise before the week was done. The arsenal of democracy had a heartbeat, and it was measured in bombers per hour. The train shuddered to a halt in the gray drizzle of a Michigan morning. Otto Kramer, pressed against the barred window of his Pullman car, blinked through the condensation on the glass. Beyond the tracks stretched a sea of lights and smokestacks, their red beacons glowing faint against the clouds. He did not know the name, Willow Run, but he could feel the hum beneath the rails, as though the earth itself was alive with machinery. Guards called out, boots clanging along the aisles, but Otto hardly heard them. His eyes had fixed on the runway that paralleled the yard. A shape moved there, massive and ungainly, engines coughing to life one by one. 4 propellers spun into blurred discs, and with a deep-throated growl, the bomber began to roll. He had seen B-24s in the desert, lumbering beasts that vomited bombs across Africa, but never like this. This one was brand new, paint unscarred, glass nose gleaming. It gathered speed, tail lifting, and then it was gone, wheels up, climbing into the low ceiling of cloud. The prisoners leaned forward, muttering. Before their whispers settled, another machine was already taxiing behind it. Then another. A line of them stretched into the distance, wings catching the dim light like giant metallic birds waiting their turn to take flight. Otto counted 3 in less than an hour. His stomach tightened. Germany could not replace even a handful in that time. Sergeant Thomas Red McCaffrey, standing in the aisle with his rifle cradled, caught Otto staring. He smirked and spat a wad of gum into a paper cup. 1 an hour, he said casually, letting the words drop like stones. Round the clock if they feel like it. The other prisoners glanced at each other, some scoffing, some silent. Otto wanted to scoff too, but the sky above him was already vibrating again. The factory beyond the tracks was no military camp. It was bigger, mile-long hangars, parking lots crowded with cars, thousands of workers swarming through gates as if they were going to a football match. Clara Reynolds was among them that morning, a scarf around her hair, a lunch pail clutched in her hand. She walked with hundreds of others, some humming popular tunes, some yawning from the night shift. To them, this was routine. To Otto, it was a revelation. He remembered Germany's factories, dark, bombed-out shells where workers patched machines under blackout curtains. Here the windows glowed. Trucks rolled in with fresh aluminum, rubber, engines still wrapped in protective oil paper. There was no rationing here, no shortage. Even the scrap heaps looked wasteful, piles of shavings and rejected panels that would have been recycled twice over in the Reich. The Americans could throw away what his homeland could no longer produce. When the next bomber lifted, the guard beside Otto muttered the specifications with pride, as if reading from a brochure. B-24D Liberator, 8,000 pounds of bombs, range nearly 3,000 miles. 1050s bristling all over Otto's jaw tightened. He knew those guns. He had watched tracer lines chew through German columns. To imagine them multiplied by thousands, tens of thousands, was to imagine a sky Germany could never hope to clear. Rain pattered on the window, blurring the view, but not enough to hide the truth. Another bomber rose, engines howling, disappearing into the mist. The factory was an assembly line of thunder, a rhythm so steady it mocked the very idea of scarcity. Otto pressed his forehead to the glass and felt his certainty crumble. Later that night, as the train pulled away, Otto wrote a single line in his notebook. If this is waste, then Germany is already finished. The fog lay heavy over East Anglia in early 1944, damp and clinging, muffling the clatter of boots on dispersal pads. Lieutenant General James H. Jimmy Doolittle stood at the edge of the runway, hands jammed into his greatcoat pockets, watching a squadron of P-51 Mustangs prepare for takeoff. Only 2 years earlier, the 8th Air Force had been bleeding itself white over Germany, bomber formations shattered by Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that struck with impunity, once beyond the reach of short-legged escorts. Now the equation had changed, and Doolittle knew it. The Mustang in front of him nosed forward, its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine purring with restrained menace. Its profile was elegant, wings taut, canopy gleaming. 6.5 zero-caliber Browning machine guns slumbered under its wings, each one capable of 750 rounds per minute. The numbers mattered as much as the beauty: a maximum speed of 437 miles per hour, a ceiling above 40,000 feet, and, most critical of all, an operational range of 1,650 miles with external drop tanks. That range meant Berlin. It meant Leipzig. It meant that the Luftwaffe could no longer wait safely beyond reach, swooping in only when bombers were helpless. Doolittle had changed doctrine the moment he assumed command. No longer would American fighters be tethered like shepherd dogs to the bombers. Now they would hunt. The day we took our fighters off the bombers and put them against the German fighters, he later recalled, Germany lost the air war. His pilots had been waiting for this order, and the flood of new Mustangs from factories back home made it possible. Otto Kramer heard about the Mustang not from a commander, but from Red McCaffrey one damp evening outside the barracks. The sergeant leaned against the wire, cigarette glowing in the dark, and told the prisoners in slow English how the P-51s could now fly from England to Berlin and back. Otto and his fellow Germans scoffed, but the way Red described it, drop tanks under the wings, Mustangs slashing through German skies at speeds their Bf-109S struggled to match, left Otto unsettled. He had seen Allied air power over Africa, but it had always seemed distant, scattered, limited by fuel. The idea that America had solved that problem through sheer numbers and engineering gnawed at him. On the other side of the Atlantic, Clara Reynolds read about the Mustang in the Detroit Free Press while riding the streetcar to Willow Run. The article boasted of its engine production, the assembly lines in Inglewood and Dallas spitting out planes by the hundreds. She smiled faintly, imagining that somewhere in her own bomber line's shadow, another woman was riveting wings for these sleek escorts. She did not know that the plane's arrival meant her liberators would have a chance to reach their targets and return with fewer empty bunks. Back in England, the squadron lifted into the mist, one after another, the drumming sound of Merlins rising as the fog broke. Above the clouds, the sun lit their wings silver. They would meet the bombers over the channel, then sweep far ahead, diving into German formations with a freedom that had not existed a year before. In his bunk, Otto thought of those Mustangs streaking across Europe, their long range bridging oceans of doubt. He imagined a pilot half his age throttling forward, confident that fuel, production, and the full weight of an industrial democracy were at his back. It was no longer just about men against men, plane against plane. It was about numbers, relentless and impossible. Thousands of Mustangs, thousands of bombers, all fed by factories that never slept. Otto closed his notebook that night with a single word written on the last line: inevitable. The night sky above Romania flared like a furnace. Columns of flame rose from Ploiești's refineries as B-24 liberators thundered away, their bellies empty of bombs, their crews deafened by their own destruction. From the air, it looked like a city in hell. Storage tanks exploding one after another, black smoke boiling upward, the smell of petroleum burning so thick that pilots swore they could taste it on their tongues. For the men inside the Reich, it was not just fire they saw in reports. It was their future burning away. By the summer of 1944, American strategy had shifted with brutal precision. Germany's armies still fought savagely on the ground, but oil was their bloodstream, and the bloodstream could be cut. The War Production Board in Washington fed this campaign with statistics as sharp as bayonets. Tens of thousands of tons of bombs allocated specifically to oil targets, waves of sorties directed against refineries and synthetic fuel plants. The numbers became rhythm, fuel supplies down by half, then by two-thirds. By early 1945, German aircraft sat on airfields with tanks nearly empty, their once deadly engines silent for want of a gallon of fuel. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, confessed after the war what every Luftwaffe commander already knew by late 1944. The oil attacks meant the end of armaments production, he admitted, his words a verdict written in smoke and ruin. Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe's field marshal, was more bitter. The British left us with deep and bleeding wounds, but the Americans stabbed us in the heart. It was true. Britain's raids had savaged German morale, but it was the unrelenting American tide, made possible by Willow Run and its sisters, that turned the arteries dry. Otto Kramer heard whispers of the raids even from behind the wire in Texas. Guards would mention the latest headlines, and Red McCaffrey sometimes waved a newspaper page just to watch the prisoners' reactions. "Oil plants again?" Red would say with a drawl, tapping a finger against columns of black ink. Otto read enough English now to pick out the words synthetic fuel, bomb tonnage, Luftwaffe crippled. He knew what it meant. No fuel for tanks, no fuel for trucks, no fuel for fighters. He pictured Messerschmitts lined in neat rows, each one a sleek corpse waiting for fuel that would never come. In the interrogation rooms at Fort Hunt, Virginia, high-ranking German officers conceded the truth to their American handlers. Bugged quarters caught their despair. Production lines halted for lack of fuel. Panzer divisions unable to maneuver. Pilots sent into combat with only hours of training because fuel for practice flights no longer existed. To men who had once believed in blitzkrieg, the vision of a mechanized army turned to immobility was intolerable. Meanwhile, Clara Reynolds continued her shifts at Willow Run. She did not know that her bomber, rolling out of the plant at 10 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday, would be fitted with 8,000 pounds of bombs destined for a refinery in central Germany. She did not know that those raids were not just missions, but death warrants for the Reich's industry. Her hands riveted panels. Her neighbors wired instrument boards. Together, they built weapons that struck not just factories, but the very fuel lines that powered Hitler's armies. By winter, snow covered airfields in Germany where planes sat frozen, fuel barrels empty. On the Russian front, tanks were abandoned where they stalled, their crews ordered to fight on foot. Officers scribbled reports filled with words that had once seemed unimaginable in a German war diary. Immobilized, grounded, paralyzed. Otto lay in his bunk one night, staring at the rafters, listening to the faint hiss of the Texas wind through the boards. In his mind, he could see the flames at Ploiești. He had not been there, but he could imagine the heat, the roar, the oily smoke staining the sky. He thought of the Reich's pride, the Luftwaffe, the Panzers, stranded and impotent. For the first time, he did not wonder whether Germany could recover. He wondered only how long it would take to collapse. The oil war had begun as a strategy on a map in Washington, but to men like Otto, it was the final revelation. Factories could be rebuilt, tanks replaced, pilots trained, but without fuel, the machine was just a carcass. The Americans, he realized, had not only built 100,000 planes, they had found the Reich's heart and torn it out. The sound was not thunder, though it rolled like it across the French countryside. It was engines, thousands of them, gears grinding, tires humming, exhausts coughing into the damp autumn air of 1944. The Red Ball Express, the most audacious supply operation the Allies had ever attempted, stretched bumper to bumper for miles. Deuce and a halfs, the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, carried everything from artillery shells to rations, fuel cans stacked to the sky, spare tires lashed to tailgates. Their headlights burned dim under blackout shades, but the noise betrayed them. An endless procession of Detroit-made horsepower, roaring east to feed the armies breaking out of Normandy. Each truck was a symbol of abundance. Over 2.4 million trucks had been procured by the U.S. Army for the war, with some 572,500 of them CCKWs. Germany could not comprehend such figures. Where Wehrmacht divisions relied on horse carts for supply, America ran highways of steel and rubber. The Red Ball alone consumed tens of thousands of vehicles, all of them replaced with ease when wrecked or worn down. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks, drivers pushed their machines beyond limits, and still the stream of trucks flowed. Otto Kramer, still captive in Texas, had no view of Normandy's roads, but he heard the numbers from guards who boasted as though logistics were more glorious than combat. Red McCaffrey once leaned against the wire, cigarette dangling, and recited them like scripture. "A truck every 8 minutes coming off the line, Kraut. More rubber in a month than you boys see in a year. That's how we keep Patton moving." The prisoners laughed bitterly, pretending disbelief, but Otto felt the truth of it. He remembered the convoys that had thundered past the cannery in Texas, hundreds of CCKWs in a single afternoon. He had seen enough with his own eyes to know that America's waste was Germany's impossibility. Back in Michigan, Clara's brother Daniel had been drafted into the Transportation Corps. He wrote her letters about the Red Ball Express, how the trucks ran day and night, through mud and snow, with black soldiers behind the wheels who rarely slept. "We don't fight with rifles," he wrote. "We fight with axles and gas cans." Clara read the words aloud in her kitchen and realized the rivets she drove into bombers were only one part of the machine. Her brother's trucks were the arteries that made those bombers' work count. For the German generals debriefed at Fort Hunt, the impact was crushing. They had assumed America's strength lay in material alone: tanks, planes, guns. What they failed to grasp was the invisible weapon of logistics. A panzer division could be destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again, but once its supplies failed, it ceased to exist as a fighting force. Reports smuggled from Europe into the POW camps confirmed what Otto suspected. Allied columns never slowed for want of fuel or ammunition. Trains pulled into depots with boxcars of food, cigarettes, and clothing. Trucks departed stacked with crates of 75mm shells, enough to smother any German battery in fire. The irony was bitter. In Germany, civilians collected scraps of rubber, melted down aluminum pots, saved every ounce of grease. In America, Red told them, trucks were abandoned when they broke down, left by the roadside to be replaced by another. "We waste more engines in a month than you'll build in a year," he sneered one evening. Otto wanted to dismiss it as swagger, but the sight of endless convoys in Texas told him it was no boast. The Red Ball Express became a legend not for its glamour, but for its relentlessness. It showed that war could be won not just with courage at the front, but with machinery humming far behind it. Every shell that burst over a German trench, every gallon of fuel that carried a Sherman forward, every bomber that rose from an English field owed something to the endless lines of trucks. Otto lay awake one night, hearing the distant rumble of a highway beyond the camp. He imagined it stretching across an ocean, endless headlights burning toward the heart of Europe. The Reich had once prided itself on discipline, precision, and strength. But what discipline could matter against a nation that measured victory in convoys per hour? The skies over Germany in the autumn of 1944 no longer belonged to the Reich. Where once squadrons of BF-109s and FW-190s had clawed down bomber streams with ruthless efficiency, now the air vibrated with a different sound, the steady drone of hundreds of American bombers escorted by fighters that never seemed to run dry. To stand in a German city and look up was to see formations so vast they seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other, contrails scribbling white scars across the sky. Otto Kramer did not witness those raids directly, but their echoes reached him even in Texas. Guards carried newspapers that reported tonnage dropped, oil plants destroyed, rail yards flattened. The figures blurred into a rhythm: 3,000 tons today, 4,000 tomorrow. Entire industrial districts erased in a week. Otto heard them muttered in English and translated by fellow prisoners. He pretended indifference, but each statistic weighed on him like a stone. For the Luftwaffe pilots still flying, the truth was cruel. Fuel was scarce, so scarce that new pilots trained on gliders or logged barely a handful of flight hours before being thrown into combat. They climbed into cockpits with engines coughing on watered-down gasoline, ordered to face enemy squadrons flying machines fresh from American factories. A Mustang could race 437 miles per hour, its 6.50 caliber guns throwing rivers of lead. Germany's aircraft, still deadly on paper, were outnumbered, outflown, and increasingly flown by boys with no chance to survive their first sortie. The numbers told a story sharper than any propaganda. In 1944 alone, the United States accepted 95,272 aircraft, nearly 100,000 planes in 12 months. Germany, by contrast, produced only about 39,800 that year, many of them destroyed before they even reached frontline units. The impossible comparison was not lost on the men who studied the ledgers. A single American year outpaced an enemy's entire war. At Fort Hunt in Virginia, captured Luftwaffe officers revealed the despair that had settled in their ranks. Hidden microphones caught their words. "We can no longer protect the skies. Our fighters sit for lack of fuel. The Americans build more planes in a month than we can fly in a year." These were not boasts from guards, not rumors in a POW camp. They were confessions from men who had once commanded wings. Meanwhile, Clara Reynolds in Michigan kept her rhythm at Willow Run. Each rivet she set felt routine, yet she sometimes paused and imagined her bomber flying in those vast streams. She could not picture the devastation on the ground, but she knew what the numbers meant. If her factory had delivered another 100 planes last month, they were already part of the thunder rolling over Germany. She read that the Allies had achieved air supremacy, a phrase she repeated to herself, tasting its power. Otto heard the same phrase from Red McCaffrey, who leaned against the wire one evening and said with satisfaction, "You boys lost the sky. That's the end of it." Otto tried to argue that German fighters were still strong, still deadly. Red only shook his head. "Doesn't matter. You can't build them fast enough. You can't fuel them long enough, and we'll keep sending more." The image haunted Otto. Runways lined with beautiful machines, wings gleaming, but no fuel to lift them, and no pilots trained to fly them. He thought of those bombers lifting from Willow Run every hour, of Mustangs flying to Berlin and back. The arithmetic was merciless. Even if every German pilot shot down 2, 3, 5 bombers, the stream would continue. The stream was endless because it was not built in a single hangar or arsenal. It was built by a nation. By the winter of 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow, its aces killed or grounded, its factories bombed, its fuel gone. The collapse was not sudden. It was slow suffocation. Otto felt it from half a world away, his certainty dissolving with each statistic that reached him. Germany had gambled on courage, discipline, and tradition. America had answered with abundance. In Washington, the War Production Board offices smelled of ink and paper, stacks of reports piled higher than a man's chest. Clerks bent over adding machines that clattered day and night, feeding columns of numbers into summaries bound for the president's desk. Each figure represented a factory shift, a completed fuselage, a shipment of ammunition, but together they told a story that even generals struggled to believe. By 1945, America's war economy had produced the impossible: more weapons, more vehicles, more aircraft than any enemy could ever match. The reports on aircraft were the most staggering. In 1942, the United States had accepted 47,675 airplanes. In 1943, the figure soared to 85,433, and in 1944, the year Otto Kramer sat in his Texas barracks listening to guards boast, it reached 95,272, nearly 100,000 planes in 12 months. No other nation in history had approached such output. The Luftwaffe, for all its reputation, managed only 39,800 that same year. In one American year, the sky had been decided. Trucks filled the next set of ledgers. The Army had procured some 2.4 million of them, an ocean of wheels and engines. Of those, more than 500,000 were the rugged GMC CCKWs, the deuce and a halves that powered the Red Ball Express and carried Patton's tanks across France. Germany's army still relied on horses and wagons for much of their transport. The contrast was so severe that American officers sometimes joked they fought with trucks, not rifles. Artillery and ammunition figures followed, each one a blow. Billions of rounds of small arms ammunition rolled off assembly lines, so plentiful that training ranges burned through cartridges without concern. German recruits fired a few rounds a week, rationed like gold. Americans fired hundreds in practice, thousands in combat, confident that more crates would arrive tomorrow. Waste became a weapon. What America discarded casually could have armed entire German divisions. Otto heard these numbers in fragments, guards repeating them, newspapers passed around the camp, lectures given to visiting civilians. He had always believed numbers were abstract, propaganda inflated for morale. But he had seen the convoys, the trains, the factory gates in Michigan. He knew enough to understand that the arithmetic was real. Each statistic was not a boast. It was a verdict. Clara Reynolds never saw the ledgers, but she lived inside them. Every rivet she set was one among billions. Every bomber that rolled out of Willow Run was one line in a column that stretched beyond imagination. She worked beside women who had once been school teachers, farmers' wives, college students, all of them now part of a machine whose measure was counted in thousands of tons of steel and aluminum each month. They did not need to know the totals to feel their weight. The proof roared overhead as bombers left the plant every hour. At Fort Hunt, German generals confronted the avalanche of statistics during interrogations. Some scoffed, refusing to believe. Others sat in stunned silence. When presented with the aircraft figures, one Luftwaffe officer reportedly muttered, "Then the war was lost before it began." They had imagined America as a sleeping giant. They had not imagined that when awake, the giant would drown them in production. The final tallies were not just numbers. They were the measure of a democracy mobilized, a society that had turned its full weight to war without losing the vibrancy of civilian life. American cities still bustled, farms still produced, shops still sold goods in abundance. Even prisoners like Otto ate better than many German civilians. The statistics proved what the prisoners already sensed. America was not soft. It was inexhaustible. As 1945 dawned, Otto closed his notebook, no longer bothering to add the columns. The numbers had grown beyond comprehension. He could only feel their weight pressing down on him. The avalanche was complete. It had buried the Reich. The war ended for Otto Kramer not with a final battle, but with the hiss of a train in the spring of 1946. The POW camp gates in Texas opened and columns of weary men marched out carrying canvas duffels slung over their shoulders. After 3 years of captivity, They were going home to a country they hardly recognized. Otto walked with the others, boots raising small clouds of dust, the dry wind tugging at his uniform. He felt more like an exile returning to ruins than a soldier coming home victorious. The train rattled across the Midwest and Northeast, passing through farmland green with spring. Otto stared out the window, marveling at how untouched everything looked. Service stations sold fuel without ration lines. Grocery stores displayed bright signs for radios, soap, even meat. Children played baseball in wide fields, their laughter untroubled by bomb sirens. He thought of Germany, its cities broken by fire, its children waiting for watery soup in ruins. The contrast was unbearable. At the station, Otto saw Sergeant Thomas "Red" McCaffrey one last time. The American still chewed gum, rifle slung loose, but now his manner was softer. He shook hands with a few prisoners, telling them to make something decent out of what's left. Otto managed a nod. Red had never lied. Every boast he'd dropped about trucks, Mustangs, bombers had proved true. The voyage across the Atlantic was cramped, the Liberty ship groaning in the gray swells. Otto leaned against the railing, staring at the horizon, thinking of Willow Run and the endless convoys he had glimpsed. He remembered the guard's words: 1 bomber an hour, 95,000 planes in a year. The numbers had once seemed absurd. Now they were carved into memory. Germany greeted him with silence and ash. Bremerhaven's docks smelled of salt and ruin, the streets lined with bombed-out shells of houses. His family met him with tears, thinner than he remembered, their faces hollow from years of hunger. On their table sat black bread and weak broth. Otto thought bitterly of POW rations in America: white loaves, butter, meat, milk. Even as a prisoner, he had lived better than his family had in freedom. Clara Reynolds, thousands of miles away, set down her rivet gun for the last time. Willow Run slowed, contracts canceled, workers sent home. She packed away her coveralls and returned to being a mother, though she never fully left the war behind. Somewhere in Europe her bombers had flown, and men like Otto had felt their weight. Otto carried something unexpected back into the ruins: respect. He told neighbors that America was not weak, but abundant. It was not cruelty, but generosity that had broken the Reich. Red's farewell echoed in his mind. Make something decent of what's left. Otto resolved to do so, having seen how strength could be measured not in brutality, but in plenty. Decades later, in the National World War II Museum, visitors tilt their heads toward the ceiling where a silver P-51 Mustang hangs in perfect preservation. Beside it, a restored B-24 Liberator stretches its wings, suspended as though still climbing from a Michigan runway. The placards below list numbers that sound more like legend than history. Nearly 300,000 aircraft built by America during the war, with almost 100,000 in 1944 alone. Children read the words aloud in disbelief. For modern eyes, it is difficult to imagine. How could a democracy feed its people, protect its homeland, and still deliver a torrent of bombers and fighters greater than all its enemies combined? The answer lies in the collective will of a free nation. Farmers, machinists, riveters, engineers, millions of ordinary citizens became the arsenal of democracy. Willow Run produced a bomber every hour. In the same span of time, a convoy of trucks rolled off assembly lines. Trains left depots stacked with ammunition, bound for every theater of war. Otto Kramer visited such exhibits in his later years. He walked slowly beneath the machines that had once filled him with dread, his cane tapping the floor. He remembered the first glimpse through a prison train window, the line of bombers rising into Michigan skies, and felt again the shock of realizing that the war was unwinnable. He had lived long enough to see Germany rebuilt, long enough to know America not as an enemy, but as an ally. Yet he never forgot the lesson. Abundance had been the true weapon. For Clara Reynolds, the legacy was quieter. She lived her life in Michigan, raised children and grandchildren, rarely speaking of the factory. Only in old age, when historians called her part of Rosie the Riveter, did she admit how proud she was. She remembered the smell of hot aluminum, the ache in her arms, and the sound of bombers rolling out one after another. 1 an hour, she would whisper, the impossible statistic that had bent the war's arc. General Jimmy Doolittle, years before his death, summed it up in a single line. The day our fighters went hunting, Germany lost the air war. His words were true, but only possible because factories delivered endless streams of planes to his command. Strategy had teeth only because democracy had filled the jaws. Today, the legacy of that abundance lives not only in museums, but in the world it preserved. Democracy triumphed because it proved that freedom could organize itself into strength greater than tyranny's command. Softness had been an illusion. The true reality was resilience, generosity, and scale. The roar of bombers has long since faded, but the numbers remain, etched into history, impossible and undeniable. 100,000 planes in a year, a miracle of production, a testament of will. America's abundance was its final argument, and it won the war.